across Europe. But fortunately, his crusade happened to be one of the larger crusades. And they had a moderate success on the crusades. But another thing that happened on the crusades, some of the common people went on the crusades, and as they met defeat, the common people saw something. They gave them courage. They saw the lords being defeated, begging the infidel Turks and the infidel Arabs for mercy. They understood that these were human beings and not gods. When these men would get back to their respective countries, they would let this be known. And so they would now demand some basic human rights and some basic decency for themselves. Would not be kicked around like dogs, because they were treated worse than dogs when they left. Now, while the old lords were away during the crusades, the young lords gave up a privilege that the old lords were trying to hold on to, and that is the right of first night. If you were a serf on my land and you married, I had the right to spend the first night with your wife. The young lords gave up that right while the old lords were away without the old lords' permission. And they couldn't take it back when they got back. Don't sound like a big deal, but that was a big deal for them. The fact that these young, arrogant lords had given up their privilege to sleep with the serf's wife the first night of the marriage. So now this is a major reform in the living conditions of the serf. These were white slaves to whites. What I'm trying to show you is that the 300-year making of the mentality of the European that ultimately gonna go into the enslavement of the blacks. What the blacks failed to understand is that the European mentality that enslaved us, that is still intact, was a long time in the making. But once it was crystallized, it was there to stay. And I call this the evil genius of Europe. And you've got to understand that mentality. Because black people are hung up with the concept. They are human beings just like us. You are not. They are not. They are human beings shaped by a condition of history. And you are human beings shaped by a condition of history. And you are shaped by an environmental condition and by a cultural condition. And if you understand something which I've gone over repeatedly, but I still think you missed the point, that all of us are shaped by three meetings of history. The people of the sand, the people of the sun, and the people of the ice. The Europeans are still the people of the ice to this day. The Africans are still the people of the sun to this day. The Arabs are still the people of the sand to this day. And each one of us act according to the environment that produced us. And you still act with the sentiment and the beautiful humanity that came out of that sun. And maybe we have spent too much time expecting the sun in the sand, in the ice, to get together. We should let each one fall in its respective place and stay there. And when Marcus Garvey said Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad, he might have just had the point. Asia for the Asians, Europe for the Europeans, Africa for the Africans, and let it be. Now, there was a time when each emperor with enough power who wanted to impress the Pope found his own crusades. But this petered out until a group of children in Europe decided that if the adults have failed, we will go and rescue the Holy Grail. We will go across Europe and do what they failed to do. And this is the last and the most tragic of all of the crusades, the Children's Crusade. The most tragic crusade in history. 250,000 children, maybe a little more, marched across Europe. These kids were sincere, dedicated Christian children, marched across Europe saying that they would go and rescue the Christian ornamentations in the holy places. Adults integrated themselves with the kids ostensibly to help them. But half of them froze to death, died of hunger. And when they got to the warm waters of the Mediterranean in the spring, they discovered that the adults came in to help them were really slave traders who sold the rest to the infidel Arabs that they were supposed to be fighting. One of the tragic events in human history. Now, if the African understood that event, if the Africans had insight and understood what the Europeans were doing to the Europeans, he could have saved himself from the slave trade. So if these people would do that to their children, there's nothing for me to expect. And when the European hit his shore, he'd have killed them on sight. That'd have been the end of that. He wasn't alerted to it. He was still hung up with the fact that if I have humanity, somebody else come, I'll treat him like he's a human being because I'm a human being. He invited him for dinner. Treat him like a guest. And end up being a slave. That same kind of sentiment is still among African people to this very day. Still that naivete about the gas. The Aztecs in Mexico did the same thing with Cortez, and he took over Mexico. Less than 2,000 men took over all Mexico. Came as the guest, stayed as the conqueror. We non-Western people never learned. Hadn't learned to this very day. All right, now, Europe is awakening from the Middle Ages and from the Dark Ages. The Africans are still ruling Spain, they still block Europe from the Mediterranean, and yet the storm is gathering in Spain between two sets of Africans. And this storm is gathering because the Muslims are beginning to fight among themselves. Portugal